Hello, welcome to this course module on distribution and supply chain management. This video lecture goes hand in hand with the readings in chapter 9 of our textbook, Marketing of High Technology Products and Innovations. Distribution channels are one of the 4 P's of the marketing mix: product, price, promotion, and the last P is place. Place is the physical place which denotes distribution. And distribution channels, they are a very durable marketing asset. They are difficult to set up in a new market, but once they're set up, they also have a pretty long life, and it's quite difficult to change the channels that a company puts in place in a particular market. Now, why do companies very often outsource their distribution to independent companies? It's just because it's economically efficient and it provides leverage. Manufacturers specialize in manufacturing, and independent distribution companies specialize in physical transportation and merchandising and customer service and all of those things. And what's the difference between distribution and supply chain management? Well, supply chain management is the bigger concept. It includes all of the companies in the supply chain of an organization. Let's say you're a manufacturer like the Ford Motor Company, then you will have in your upstream supply chain, you will have various suppliers of raw materials and components. For example, Ford might buy tires from Michelin, and they might buy seats from Johnson Controls. So those are examples of suppliers in the upstream part of the supply chain. And downstream, Ford has a number of distribution channel partners, all the Ford dealers in their network who specialize in making test drives available to customers and providing them with pre-sales and after-sales service and so on. So when we talk of distribution channels, that's just a subset of the supply chain management downstream of the manufacturer. So these two concepts are interrelated, but distribution channels are just a subset of the entire supply chain. Let's talk about how distribution channels evolve over the product life cycle. Very simply, a product life cycle shows the cumulative sales of the product over time, and we can distinguish 4 stages: introduction, where the sales are rather slow to pick up, then a period of sudden growth, followed by maturity and decline. Now, when a business is new and has just launched a product in the introduction stage, then it wants to have direct relationships with its business partners like OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, and systems integrators. So, in high technology, whenever something whenever some new innovation is launched, then you need to educate the customers, and therefore a direct relationship does help. But then when you get into growth, then the demand is assured, and so you really need to expand distribution. If you were only to have direct channels, that would be a constraint on growth. But if you get into indirect channels, then you're exploiting the distribution capacity in early growth. So typically in early growth, you sign agreements with a number of independent distributors and value added resellers. In late growth, the growth is slowing down, and you want to again push to the mainstream market. So you might make your high tech product available in traditional retailers, let's say department stores, for example. And then finally, in maturity, when there's a whole lot of competition and it's important to cut costs, then you want to distribute to through mass merchants like Walmart and Target and so on. So what we see is that the general trend of channels in high tech is that you start out more with direct relationships, and then as the product life cycle progresses, you go more into indirect channels of distribution. So there are many types of channels, and direct channels indicate that there is no independent businesses between the manufacturer and the end user. Direct channels could include a website for e-commerce. It could include a direct sales force, as in business to business marketing. It could include company owned retail stores, as Apple has. So those are all examples of direct channels. And indirect channels are where you use independent businesses like wholesalers and retailers between the manufacturer and the end user. And of course, as a company grows, as it addresses larger global markets, then it might need a combination of direct and indirect channels, and those combinations are called multiple or hybrid channels. While the upside to multiple or hybrid channels is that it gives you much more extensive reach in the marketplace, the downside is that sometimes your own channels start competing against each other. They're all carrying your brand. So you might have your website selling your product like Apple does, but Apple also sells through other channels like Best Buy or Target or one of the other independent retailers. So this can lead to what is called intra-brand competition. There's competition within your brand across your channels, and very often this can cause channel conflict. For example, the offline retailers could complain that your website is undercutting them on price, or that you know some channels are the low cost channels which don't invest in service, and they're taking business away from the more up service or upmarket channels which provide a lot of service. So then these problems need to be dealt with, and that is the realm of channel management. In most high tech companies like Cisco, there's a very active sales force whose job is to keep in touch with all the value added resellers and systems integrators and make sure that they are motivated and incentivized to distribute and sell the product. And if there are issues of channel conflict that come up, then they try to resolve those issues. So when we get into the growth stage of the product life cycle, then a business usually has to consider indirect distribution channels. And here there are some important design issues. Two of the more important ones are how many different channels should a business have, as in direct versus indirect, and then within a channel, how many levels should there be? So let's talk about these issues. The number of different channels is really based on how many customer segments there are in the market, because each segment has a unique set of needs, and each channel offers a unique set of services to meet the segment needs. So, for example, when we have a high tech company selling directly from a website, then that serves the segment of customers who are very comfortable with technology. They know the product, they don't need any extensive pre-sale support, and they're happy to buy at lower prices. On the other hand, the indirect channels in high tech are often for the consumer market where people are not as familiar with technology and they may like to see a product demo or they may need to ask some questions of the salesperson. So, therefore, you have two different channels serving different segments. And within a channel, the question is how many businesses should carry a product. So, if you have wholesale distributors and retailers, those are two levels within the channel, and they also serve different target markets. The wholesalers serve retail businesses, and then the retail businesses serve end consumers. And how many businesses should carry your product is really is called the intensity of distribution, and there are three options. Intensive distribution means let anybody who has cash and is willing to carry a product, let them carry it without any reservations or qualifications. At the other extreme, exclusive distribution is within a geographical territory, you only allow one business to have the rights to carry your product. And in between that, you have what's called selective distribution, which means that you choose a certain number of distributors within a geographical territory, but you qualify them on the basis of their track record or financial net worth and so on. So, in general, as a company decides to target larger and larger global markets, then it needs many more channels and it also needs many more levels in each channel to have a greater reach and penetration in the marketplace. Now we get into the area of distribution of digital goods. We know for so many products, whether it's software or music or movies, um, the old offline model is pretty much passé. We don't really go to a video store like Blockbuster to rent DVDs anymore. Pretty much we can stream videos from websites like Netflix, or we can rent TV shows from iTunes. So there's some very interesting differences in the distribution of digital goods when you get to the web versus the earlier offline business models of traditional bricks and mortar retailing. So the new marketplace is the new marketplace for digital goods. And let's take the example of Netflix. If we look at movies, then the preference distribution is that maybe 20% of all the movies that are released are huge blockbuster hits, which are shown by the popularity of the red head of this particular distribution. On the other hand, 80% of the products are in the long tail, which means each of those movies by themselves is not very popular, but if you aggregate the demand of all the products in the long tail, then that could add up to a substantial market. Now, when you only had the offline retail model like a Blockbuster, then the constraint was on retail shelf space, a scarce resource. So Blockbuster really could only fill their shelves with the head products, the ones that were blockbuster hits, and they couldn't carry very many independent films or foreign films, which was a limitation. Now, when you go to the web model of a Netflix, they really don't have to have any physical inventory. They just have the digital copies of the movies on servers, and so you can stock a large variety of independent and foreign films, and that's exactly what has made Netflix pretty popular. They are trying to shape consumer behavior and get us to appreciate more these independent and foreign films which are in the long tail of distribution. The bottom line takeaway is that the long tail of distribution and the digital marketplace on the web make it possible for business models to exist by aggregating the demand of all the individual items in the long tail. So that has probably improved, the quality of movies and the variety that's made available to consumers. And so that is a new phenomenon called the long tail of distribution of digital goods. Next, we come to the phenomenon of grey markets, and we have to distinguish that from black markets or white markets. So, the first point is that most legal markets are called white markets, they are legitimate by law. At the other extreme, black markets are completely illegal. So, if you have buyers and sellers transacting in illegal drugs like cocaine or heroin, or if there are illegal trading of guns and ammunition without permits, then those constitute the black market. The grey market is somewhere in between the black and the white market. The product itself is not illegal. These are all legitimate products. They may be, smartphones and tablets and other types of branded, electronic devices or software. But the channel in which they are made available is unauthorized. So this leads to some very interesting dynamics in the marketplace. Usually the goods available in the grey market are available at a discounted price. So the authorized dealers often complain of intra-brand competition and they cry foul. They say that we as authorized dealers, we provide all the pre-sale service to the customer, but then the customer, instead of buying from us, goes and buys from the grey market at a cheaper price. So we lose the business. And so this is demotivating for the authorized reseller or the authorized distributor, who lose the motivation to push sales and provide service. The grey market is a huge problem for marketeers who are proud of their brand and want to preserve their brand equity. So first let me give an example of grey markets. When Apple launched the first iPhone in 2007, it was only available initially in the US. But it was such a breakthrough product, it was so popular that we had people from other countries like China, they were coming to the US buying, these iPhones and taking them back to their home country in their suitcase. And these, these products were made available in the alleys and byways of Shanghai or Beijing. So that's an example of a grey market. Apple did not authorize those people to sell in China, but they were buying them in the US, marking them up and selling them to rich people in China. And why does it affect Apple? Because, you know, although the customer or the end user might initially be happy to buy from the gray market, if really something goes wrong with the product, then they cannot go back to Apple and ask for any warranty service because it was not sold through a legitimate channel. And then that makes customers unhappy. So the the goal of most marketeers is to try to minimize the gray market, find the source of the leakage and then try to fix it. It may not be possible to reduce it to zero, but the gray market is a problem for marketeers who are conscious and sensitive about brand equity. So, here are some causes that give rise to the gray market. If a company sells product on the basis of volume discount, then some of the distributors who can buy more, they buy it at a cheaper price. And then if they have extra stock and cannot sell in their local market, even though they are authorized to sell, they might sell it at a discount in some secondary market to unauthorized resellers. So, basically it's the authorized resellers who may at some point be leaking the product to unauthorized sellers, and that may be a cause. There are differentials in international exchange rates. We know between neighboring countries how this can give rise to arbitrage. In Canada, for example, those people who live very close to the border with the US, say north of New York or north of Detroit, very often they cross the border, they buy goods cheaply in the US and they take them back and they resell them at a profit without the permission of the company. So that's another cause of the gray market. Sometimes different resellers have different cost structures. Large resellers will have lots of fixed cost or overhead, and then family run resellers will have much lower cost and overhead. So again, this gives rise to the opportunity for arbitrage, that the resellers who are not authorized, they may buy from the lower cost reseller and then go and sell it at a markup in unauthorized markets. Highly selective distribution. This is a problem with capacity. If a company doesn't have enough units to sell and it limits the markets in which it releases its products, there may be a pent-up demand in other countries where it's not available, and that can give rise to gray markets. So we see on the left here that there are many causes for the gray markets, and sometimes it's the internal policies of the manufacturer that may give rise to the gray market. So what do they need to do? If you can find the source of the gray market, then that might be an authorized reseller and you terminate them because they have violated their agreement by selling to somebody who is not authorized. Sometimes you can adjust your pricing policy to avoid arbitrage, especially between neighboring countries. If there's a shortage of your product in certain places, then you have to increase the availability by market penetration. And then finally, you've got to have internal policies that are consistent and don't reward your employees or managers for just large sales volume, but they also worry about selling them to the right customers. So again, the bottom line takeaway here is that grey markets are a problem for all kinds of high-tech products that might be in short supply when they are launched, and the marketeers have a responsibility to try to minimize the grey market. Otherwise, it could lead to customer dissatisfaction and negative brand equity. Okay, now we get into supply chain management. And here is a phenomenon called the bullwhip effect, which illustrates the problem of demand and supply uncertainty. So here on the right you have a end user or consumer holding the handle of a bullwhip. And you know the way a bullwhip operates, a small flick of the hand will result in small amplitude closer to the end user. But as you go away from the end user, the magnitude of the wave increases and expands. So what does this mean? As far as the end user or customer goes, small changes in demand at the consumer level translate into larger fluctuations in the stocks of the businesses serving the end consumer. So let's take the example of consumers who started liking touch screens in 2007 when Apple launched the iPhone. So when there was initially a trend to expand the sales of touch screens, then the suppliers of the components, they actually expanded and increased their inventory quite a lot because they don't want to be surprised by stockouts. So as you go upstream in the supply chain, those businesses and suppliers, they are increasing the amount of stocks they keep on hand because stockouts are negative for any business. And then what happens? Suppose that the demand for the end product changes and it falls very quickly. Then those suppliers which supply the customer, they will have to liquidate their excess inventory. So that gives rise to the down part of these amplitude of the waves. So what it means is that small changes in consumer tastes and preferences lead to large fluctuations in the demand and supply of these products, which means it's really difficult to do good forecasting and it's very difficult for supply to match demand perfectly. And the job of the supply chain is to minimize these bullwhip fluctuations. So what are the implications of this? We need to design and build better supply chains. So this is the final slide in my module here. We consider two factors in the design of the supply chain. There is demand uncertainty, which is the uncertainty of consumer tastes and preferences. Very often consumers are fickle. They don't know exactly what they want. They'll try out something. If they like it, they'll buy more. If they don't like it, they'll drop it. And supply uncertainty has to do with all those bullwhip fluctuations, how much inventory to stock. If we overstock, then we have to get rid of it later in some distress sales. So we can categorize demand and supply uncertainty into two categories, high and low. And the simplest type of supply chain is in the top bottom corner, in the bottom right corner, where the demand and supply uncertainty is very low. We need to have an efficient supply chain. Just figure out the forecast easily and then stock enough to meet that demand. Example of efficient supply chain would be Walmart in retailing. Then if we go to the top right, we have a condition of demand uncertainty being low, which means forecasting is relatively easy, but there's a lot of supply uncertainty, and this could be due to having only one supplier. So basically, you've got to develop alternative sources of supply, and that means you develop risk hedging supply chain. You know, even if you have two suppliers, make sure that they are not in the same geographical area prone to earthquakes or tsunamis or something like that. Locate them in different parts of the world. That's what a risk hedging supply chain is meant to do. And indeed, most technology companies, when they do outsourced manufacturing, they do try to avoid having just one supplier. They might have, for example, two outsourced manufacturers. One may be in China and another one may be in Mexico. That way you do the risk hedging. Okay, on the left bottom you have a condition where there is high demand uncertainty, but there is low supply uncertainty. That means that customer tastes and preferences are changing rapidly, but you know it's pretty easy to give them what they want, and that's what we call a responsive supply chain. A good example of that is Dell Computer. Uh, Dell allows customers to pick and choose whatever configurations they want, and then they maintain their inventory not in the end product but in components and sub-assemblies. So then within 48 hours they are able to put the configuration together and ship it to the customer, and that leads to a pretty high response and satisfaction. Finally, on the top left, where both conditions are high, demand uncertainty is high and supply uncertainty is high, this is the condition of most radical and breakthrough innovations when they are first introduced. Then we need an agile supply chain, whether it's the Nintendo Wii or the Apple iPhone or any other hot product which will be in demand, and all the demand estimates exceed your expectations, then your supply chain has to be agile and scramble to get demand and supply to match. So these are all of the important concepts in chapter 9. Again, distribution channels are a very important marketing asset. There's a big human element to it. That's why we need to treat distributors as our partners, as our allies, and marketing must have people in sales or channel management who will call on the distribution channel members and make sure that their needs are met and they're getting a fair share of the incentives in order to be in business for a sustainable period of time. That concludes this module on distribution and supply chain management. I hope this has been insightful and interesting, and I look forward to receiving your feedback. Thank you.